Hi everyone, this video is about the natural selection, focusing on the mechanism of natural selection in the paper Evolution. First we can see the Darwin theory of natural selection. Darwin was an eminent English naturalist cum geologist who proposed that all species of organisms have evolved over time from pre-existing ancestors through natural selection. He was interested by the patterns of distribution and similarities of organisms in the Galapagos Island during his 5 years long voyage in the survey ship HMS Beagle. And based on his observations, Darwin formulated his theory of natural selection. And along with Wallace, he explains the evolution of new species and is called the theory of organic evolution by natural selection, or simply the theory of natural selection. And according to this theory, the organic evolution results from the operation of 7 natural forces, natural forces, and they are the overproduction or prodigality of production, then a differential reproduction of the offspring, and that leads to a struggle for existence among the organisms, and those who are adaptive, those who are adapted, or those who have a useful and heritable variations survive. Then survival of the fittest occurs. Then the nature select the fittest one, and finally the speciation occur. The natural selection and origin of species, the organisms which survive the struggle for existence transmits their heritable variation to the next generation, and in this process the nature selects and preserves the favorable variation and rejects the unfavorable or the harmful ones, and this is called the natural selection. And this will over many successive generation, this results in the preservation and progressive accumulation of successful heritable variation in the natural population. And it may also cause a progressive increase in the frequency of profitable variations. On the whole, the struggle for existence, natural selection, and the genetic transmission and accumulation of favorable variation over many successive generations tend to progressively increase the adaptability, fitness, survival value, and evolutionary potentiality of organisms. And this is in probability lead to the gradual transformation of a species to a new one, and this is called the origin of species by natural selection. Next we can see some examples of natural selection. When we think about the examples for natural selection, first that come into our mind is the industrial melanism, that the black-winged moths are get selected by the nature than the white-winged moth. Next example is the resistance of mosquitoes against DDT. In the 50s and 60s of the last century, DDT was extensively used to destroy the mosquitoes for the eradication of malaria and filaria. But at that time it is a grand success, but now it failed. Why? Because at that time only some DDT resistant mosquitoes are there, but later the DDT usage is increased. So the resistant DDT resistant mosquitoes have the selective or competitive advantage or dominance over the DDT sensitive ones. So they only survive and the others get perished. So the resistant forms gradually multiplied and after a period of time formed the major part of mosquitoes population. With this, DDT became ineffective for mosquito control. Thus, nature selected the fittest to survive. Next example is the sickle cell anemia. We all know that sickle cell anemia is a fatal genetic disorder and it is caused by the recessive gene mutation, and its characterization is the abnormal hemoglobin in RBCs. It's called the sickle cell hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin makes RBCs sickle shaped. Homozygous condition of the sickle cell gene leads to massive destruction of RBCs, severe anemia, and early death of patient. However, its heterozygous condition is somewhat advantageous because it gives some protection against malaria. That's in it's a heterozygous condition. The gene decreases oxygen binding capacity of hemoglobin, and in the absence of sufficient oxygen in hemoglobin, the malarial parasites fail to survive and multiply in the RBCs, so they get perished, and this in turn gives some protection from malaria. Thus, the sickle cell gene in the heterozygous condition gives some resistance against malaria, and so nature has selected and preserved it in human population. Next, we can see the mechanism of natural selection. The natural selection occurs when an organism is favored by the nature, and this happens when the strongest and the best fit to survive are able to reproduce, and the offspring inherit traits that are good for the species, and this leads to the evolution, finally leads to the evolution along with the common descent. Then the mechanism of natural selection includes the variation, overproduction, competition, and survival of the fittest. First one is the variation, that is within a population and among the same species there occurs there see a wide variety of traits and differences, and this is because of the differences in their DNA. The sexually reproductive animals have the benefit of a greater genetic diversity because the zygote get one set of chromosomes from the mother and another from the father, and during meiosis there are many mechanisms which increase the variation in each sex cell, and this makes a billions of combination possible for each sperm and egg. And without variation, population could not survive with a changing environment, and those selected by the nature, the traits, the heritable variations get transmitted to the next generation. Then next is the overproduction. Organisms instinctively reproduce, and this leads to a large number of offsprings within a population. But there are so many natural pressures, that is the environment predators, that leads to the death of many offspring. In this condition, the overproduction is a greater chance of some offspring surviving to a reproductive age. And this overproduction leads to the competition for limited for food, space, water, meats, and all these are limited. They depend on the same resources for their food, space, and all. So there occurs the competition among the same species. So only those adapted one would survive, the other dies. Also competition occurs between the different species, that is called the interspecies competition, and that also leads to the extinction of a complete species. And that's why invasive species are such a problem, they can outcompete the native species. This leads to the survival of the fittest, that those organisms which have more variations or more adapted to the environment get survived. They get selected by the nature, and then these adaptations or these variations get inherited to the next generation. Let's see an example. In this picture we can see two types of mouses, white mouse and the dark one. The white mouse is less fit. Why? Because it is easily seen by the predator, easily seen or caught by the predator, and it is less likely to survive to reproductive age or produce. They can't produce many offspring. So the nature selection will select and favor the dark mouse, which is more fit, which is the same as the color of the rock. So they get survived, or they get selected by the nature. Next is the types of natural selection. Natural selection can take many forms, but usually we consider the graphical form of the distribution of traits across a population. Mainly there are three types of natural selection, that the stabilizing selection, directional selection, and a less common disruptive selection. In stabilizing selection, the nature is selecting the intermediate or the middle trait than the two extreme of a trait. Why? Because the selective pressures are working against the two extremes of a trait. For example, robins typically lay 4 eggs, and among these eggs, some are the larger clutches, and the larger clutches may result in a malnourished chicks, and that eventually leads to the die of that chicks. Then some are the smaller clutches may result in no viable offspring. Only the intermediate or the middle clutches get survived. Then next is the directional selection. Directional selection the occurs when selective pressures are working in favor of one extreme of a trait. For example, in case of industrial melanism, the dark winged moth is selected by the nature, and its population is increasing, its number is increasing than the white. Why? Because the nature is select. The nature is select. Nature select the dark colored moth. The white colored moth get over predated. The next type of natural selection is the disruptive selection. In disruptive selection, the nature is selecting the two extremes and against the intermediate trait, and this type of selection is not a common. For example, in a hypothetical population, grey and Himalayan rabbits are there and they are able to hide themselves in the rocky environment than the white rabbits. So the white rabbits get easily identified by the predator and that they get over predated. So the nature selects the two extremes of the trait. So, in conclusion, natural selection is defined as a process or a force that allows for organisms better adapted to their environment and to better survive and produce more offspring. The process of natural selection is important and is a driving force for evolution. For organisms to evolve, there needs to be differences in traits between organisms that provide certain advantages or disadvantages, and it is these traits that natural selection acts upon. So, that's all about my topic. Here are some references. Thank you.